Thanks for joining us today. My name is Matt Field. I'm a partner in Venable's Postal Law Group. For those of us who work in the postal industry, this is an exciting time, maybe not for all the right reasons, but there's no denying that postal is getting more attention right now from the press, Congress, and the president than it has for a long time. So we thought we'd take this opportunity to discuss what's happening, why it's happening, and what to expect going forward. So the way this will go, I'll start with some basics to help you understand the history of some of these issues and the current situation. My colleague Eric Berman, a partner in our postal and advertising group, will discuss some ongoing regulatory issues and their impacts on mailers. Nick Choate from our legislative group will fill you in on where things stand in Congress, and Janice Ryan, a partner in our political law group, will discuss mail's role in this year's elections and some compliance issues folks might face. Now, just a bit of a warning, some of what I'm going to talk about will be probably beyond basic for those of you already steeped in postal issues. But even so, I think it's important to be familiar with these basics to understand where the Postal Service is today, what's happening in Congress and before the regulator, and why all this is happening now. Hopefully, providing the context will help you better assess some of the statements you might hear in the press or from various sources about the Postal Service, what its current condition is and what needs to change, and help you make decisions for your business and its use of the Postal Service. But there's one thing I hope you take away from all of this today, is that the Postal Service is not going to disappear anytime soon. Not only have the financial impacts of the COVID pandemic been less than anticipated so far, but it simply provides too important a public service to be simply abandoned. Now, I admit that I've revised some of my conception of what is and is not politically untenable over the past several years, but if there's anything that's still in that untenable category, I think it'd be allowing the Postal Service to go belly up and stop delivering mail. With that said, let's start from the very beginning. What is the Postal Service? All you really need to know about what the Postal Service is that it's a government entity, but it's supposed to operate independently and apolitically. It's supposed to act like a business and support its own operations through the sale of postage. And that means it doesn't receive congressional appropriations to any significant degree. And it's been this way since it was restructured in 1970. And the idea being that we want an independent postal service that serves the American people outside of political influence and outside of the need for congressional appropriations. Everything it does needs to be funded through its sale of postage. Now, so we've got this kind of strange hybrid thing that's part government, but it's also supposed to be a business. And that shows up in the way that the Postal Service is governed and its governance structured. It's set up a lot like a private company with a board of directors and a CEO, but its directors are appointed by the president and have to be confirmed by the Senate, and it can only engage in activities that are allowed by law. So its board of governors here, it's got 9 governors plus a Postmaster General and a Deputy Postmaster General. That's the statutory requirement. Currently, if you count the 2 governors that were confirmed last week, there are 6 governors in place. We've got a new Postmaster General and no Deputy Postmaster General as of now. Governors are appointed for 7-year terms, maximum of 5 of one political party, and the purpose of the Board of Governors is to provide strategic direction for the Postal Service, act much like a corporate board would. As you probably know, we've got a new Postmaster General, just brand new on the job, Mr. DeJoy. The Postmaster General acts like the CEO of the Postal Service. Importantly, the PMG is appointed not by the president, but is selected by the governors. Mr. DeJoy is the 5th Postmaster General to come from outside the Postal Service since 1970, and he's the first since Marvin Runyon, who stepped down in 1998. The last several have all been have come up through the Postal Service, so this is a bit of a change. And we're also at a bit of an odd historical moment. As we discussed above, the Postal Service is an independent establishment, and its government structure reflects this, and that is designed to insulate the Postal Service from political influence. The governors have 7-year terms, which extend beyond a single administration. Their terms are staggered so that in the normal course of business, you'd have several governors from different administrations all acting together. And the idea behind that is to insulate the Postal Service from political influence. And together, these governors would have to select a Postmaster General, which again puts another layer of insulation. But we're in this weird moment now where for years, governors' terms were ending, they were falling off, and the Senate was not confirming new postal governors. And we reached a situation at the end of 2016 where there are actually no governors in place. Obviously, right after December 16, we got a new president, we got a new Congress in place, and this administration has been much more successful at appointing and getting confirmed governors to the Postal Board of Governors. And now we've got a kind of unique situation where all the governors have been appointed by a single president, and those governors together have selected the Postmaster General. What this means going forward is hard to tell. There's been some concerns expressed about that, but the Postal Service, regardless of who's appointing its board or influence the selection of the Postmaster General, is still governed by statute, and it still has duties and obligations that are dictated by that statute, and it has to comply with those regardless of who's in charge. Here's some of those legislative restrictions up here, and these impact the way the Postal Service does its business. As I said earlier, the Postal Service is supposed to operate like a business, but because it's a government entity and it has a statutory monopoly on letter carriage and access to the mailbox, there's some restrictions on what it can do. We'll talk about some of these in depth throughout today and how they're impacting things now, but the big one is it has obligations to pre-fund its retiree health benefits and pension obligations. There's limitations on it offering new non-postal services. So you'll hear a lot of talk about folks talking about the Postal Service should get into banking and things like that. It can't do that without congressional authorization. There's restrictions on its borrowing authority, how much it can borrow and from whom. Limitations on investment. So it's retirement funds. It can't invest them in just anything it wants. It has to invest them in treasuries, which obviously limits their growth. And not only does it have to fulfill its universal service obligation, serve all the communities in the United States, but there's also limitations on its ability to price its products. As we said, some of those restrictions there are justified by the fact that the Postal Service is a monopoly. But it doesn't hold a monopoly over everything it does. Instead, its products are divided into 2 categories. It's market-dominant products and it's competitive products, according to the degree of market power the Postal Service can exert over those products. So, and the big difference between these is that the different products have different restrictions on how the Postal Service can price its products and market these products. Market-dominant products are ones that are covered by mandatory monopoly or over which the Postal Service has de facto market power. These are things you think of as traditional mail, your letters, flats, cards, magazines. Competitive products are ones that the Postal Service has demonstrated that it lacks market power over. And these are typically packages. And the idea here is that the Postal Service customers, mailers, have alternatives they can go to if the Postal Service were to raise prices on its competitive products. They could go to UPS or FedEx, or a company like Amazon could deliver its own packages. And so the Postal Service has these competitive constraints on the prices it can set, and therefore it doesn't need regulatory constraints. Where it has a monopoly, of course, those constraints aren't there. And so the Postal Service is limited to increasing its prices to the rate of inflation, essentially. Another big difference between the two is the way that contract rates are handled. There's a lot of contract rates on the competitive side because the regulator offers little oversight over those and mostly just requires the Postal Service to demonstrate that the contract rate covers the cost of offering the service. Whereas on the market dominant side, the regulator engages in much stricter oversight of contract rates. So that's kind of the history of things, and that's how everything works. But I guess the question that we're faced with is, does it really work? And even if it was working in February 2020, has the pandemic changed things? So here on this slide are some of the things you might have heard over the years and certainly recently. The first quote there goes back to 2010. So this is 10 years ago. The Postal Service says in its 10K that it believes that its growth in volume and associated revenue, along with productivity improvements, won't be sufficient to address its financial challenges. This statement, there's been similar statements going well before that, before the 2006 Act, which established a price cap was enacted. So it's not a new sense that there's been financial problems around the Postal Service. It's really, any article you read, it seems like it's a mandatory inclusion to describe the Postal Service as the financially troubled Postal Service. But nevertheless, the Postal Service has been delivering the mail throughout this whole time. Go back last year, then Postmaster General Brennan testified that the Postal Service might run out of cash by 2024. Go earlier this year, March, in the press, there were rumors that the Postal Service would shut down in June. In April, the Postal Service went to Congress and asked for $75 billion, said it'd run out of cash by September 2020. $25 billion of that was specifically to address losses caused by the COVID pandemic. So things are looking pretty dire, it seems, but if we look at what's actually happened, maybe it's not quite so bad. Addressing the pre-COVID predictions, if you take out the pre-funding requirements that we discussed earlier, which are requirements that no other company in the United States faces, on an operational basis, the Postal Services run pretty close to break even. Even earlier this year, their financial officer testified to the Board of Governors that if Congress passed legislation that would remove some of these pre-funding requirements, they would have been right about break even now. So when you hear the financially troubled Postal Service and you hear about their big losses, a lot of it is based on these pre-funding requirements that are out there. When we go into more recent things, you'll see that in the second quarter of 2020, postal revenue was actually increasing over the prior year, But that doesn't really account for what was happening with COVID yet, because it hadn't really hit. But the Postal Service has released financials since then that do capture the impact of the COVID pandemic. And while things aren't great, they're much better than folks had feared initially. We're talking total revenue in April, and these are preliminary numbers, was only $200 million less than it was in April 2019. Below plan, but that's not an existential crisis. Personnel expenses have increased, so there's still net losses. But the big difference is, with everybody at home, with the pandemic hitting, package delivery, competitive revenues have gone up significantly. Volume up 35%, revenue up 37%. That's really offset the market dominant losses. So the losses in market dominant volume and revenue are significant. Even in April, the revenue for market dominant products is twice that of competitive products. But the competitive increases have been able to allow the Postal Service to see better results than it perhaps anticipated. And now it's said that it doesn't expect it will have to access the $10 billion of supplemental borrowing authority was granted in the CARES Act until next year sometime, September 2021, under reasonable assumptions. But the question, of course, is that volume growth in competitive products sustainable going forward? And will market dominant volumes rebound if the economy picks up in time? So the bottom line is the Postal Service still faces significant challenges. Even before the pandemic, it had rising costs and declining volumes. It was saddled with unnecessary and illogical pre-funding requirements. But the perceptions of its demise have always been a little bit greater than the reality, I'd say. So, for instance, it's true that while volume's been declining, the Postal Service still delivered 143 billion pieces of mail in 2019. That volume's not just going to completely disappear tomorrow. Somebody has to deliver it. COVID, of course, is heightening these prior challenges, and it's creating some new ones, in addition to creating uncertainty for everyone. But the Postal Service has undoubtedly played a critical role during the pandemic, and it's delivering essential information and supplies, and that role is just going to be emphasized by the fact that we're holding elections during a pandemic, and the Postal Service always plays a significant role during elections, and it'll be even greater this year. So what we're seeing is that, while there's a great deal of uncertainty here, the Postal Service has the capability to keep operating at this point, and we expect it to keep doing so for foreseeable time in the future. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot that needs to be done, and my colleagues are going to talk about some of what's happening right now in the regulatory and legislative spaces to address these challenges and opportunities, and what the impacts of these activities might have on your business over the next few months. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric to talk about some of the regulatory issues that we see.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt, and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So I think Matt provided an excellent overview of our postal system on the operations side, and I think one of the takeaways is the sky isn't necessarily falling as much as the operator has represented to us. I'll provide an overview on the regulatory side. What I'd like to do is, introduce you all to the Postal Regulatory Commission, what it does, and I want to spend a few minutes discussing what I think is the most significant rulemaking proceeding that is happening right now. It is a rate review proceeding for the products that the Postal Service has monopoly over, and I think it's very likely to impact a lot of our listeners. So here on this slide, meet your postal regulators. Our system is somewhat unique, our postal system, that is. In Washington has lots and lots of regulatory agencies, right? We all know the alphabet soup, FTC, FCC, FCC, and so on. Those agencies typically regulate marketplace actors. In the postal world, the Postal Regulatory Commission is itself an independent federal agency. So we have one independent federal agency regulating another independent federal agency in the Postal Service. And why is that? Well, Matt touched on it. Unlike almost every other federal agency, the Postal Service not only competes in the marketplace, but it has a government-granted monopoly. We typically don't like monopolies under our antitrust laws. Left to their own devices, we expect monopolists to either raise prices on their captive customers above competitive levels, or conversely reduce output or service levels below competitive levels to line their pockets. So ostensibly, the PRC is designed to protect the Postal Service's captive customers and ensure fair competition. The PRC is a relatively small agency. It is funded by congressional appropriations. That wasn't always the case. It used to actually get money directly from the Postal Service, but over the past 10, 12 years, it's gotten a congressional appropriation. I believe this year the appropriation is about $19 million. That's not a lot of money for a federal government agency. So the PRC definitely punches above its weight. It's composed of 5 commissioners. Each is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and not more than 3 commissioners can be from the same political party. If you've done any work before the Federal Trade Commission, it's exactly the same setup as that. We currently have a full slate of all 5 commissioners. I have them on this slide for you, their headshots and when their terms end. In my view, these aren't spoil system or patronage appointees. I think all 5 of these commissioners came to the commission with fairly strong background in public policy, public advocacy, economics, postal issues. Most of them spent some time on Capitol Hill working on postal issues, particularly Chairman Robert Taub. Commissioner Ann Fisher worked for Senator Susan Collins back when Congress passed the 2006 law that Matt mentioned, the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. Actually polling work on the Hill. Mark Acton, I believe, is the first and only PRC staffer to be appointed to the commission. Vice Chair Kubayanda worked at the U.S. Postal Service Office of Inspector General. So this is a qualified group, and you have them here, your postal regulators. So what role does the PRC play? And one way to think about it is, vis-a-vis the Postal Service that Matt explained. Matt talked about the Board of Governors being akin to a corporate board of directors. I think that's exactly right. It's not the PRC that sets your postal rates. The PRC doesn't manage the Postal Service. It merely regulates it. It reviews operational decisions and determines whether those decisions comply with the law and with the PRC's own regulations. So, what are some of the things that the PRC does routinely? Well, for one thing, it reviews Postal Service price changes. Many of you work at companies where, you have to budget for your postal spend for the coming year. If you're a nonprofit, perhaps, you do a lot of fundraising using direct mail. How much will postal cost? Well, the Postal Service can't just spring that on you. It can't just raise its prices when it wants, how it wants. When it wants to change rates, it has to initiate a regulatory process. It has to notify the public. It has to notify the commission at least 45 days in advance for monopoly products. The commission opens a docket and it invites the public comment on the Postal Service's pricing proposals. You may not be aware that you could do that. Anybody can do this. Last year, an individual sued the Postal Regulatory Commission over its handling of a proposed price increase for stamps, and won in the D.C. Circuit, a David beating Goliath type of situation. Anybody can participate in these types of proceedings. And I know there's some trade associations listening, and perhaps you have participated in one of them. But that's something that the Commission does, determines whether proposed rates are legal. If they are, it will approve them via order. If not, it will send the Postal Service back and require it to amend its rate adjustment notice and bring changes into compliance. Negotiated customer contracts. Matt mentioned this, sort of customized contracts. If you are a high volume package or parcel shipper, perhaps you've negotiated one of these. A customized contract, you negotiate it directly with the Postal Service, probably a sales rep. But the PRC has to review those to make sure that they meet regulatory standards. And, when we talk about these types of contracts, they are almost exclusively, I think today, maybe they are 100% exclusively for competitive products like priority mail or first class package service. We don't really see NSAs in monopoly products like periodicals, letters, greeting cards. Much easier to get it approved on the competitive side. Annual review of Postal Service compliance with regulations. The Postal Service has to provide the Commission with financial data regularly, sometimes monthly, sometimes quarterly, and annually. Within 90 days after the end of the Postal Service's fiscal year, it has to file a variety of costs, revenue, pricing, quality of service data with the Commission to demonstrate that its postal products comply with the law. It's called the annual compliance review. Again, the public can participate in this process. Complaints. Did you know that as a postal customer, you can file a formal complaint with the Postal Regulatory Commission if you believe that you are being discriminated against, that you are getting less advantageous rates or conditions of sale than similarly situated competitors? Earlier this year, a large trade association did just that. And, of course, as a regulatory body, the Commission engages in rulemakings with notice and public comments routinely. There are several big ones going on right now. One has to do with rules for postal pricing promotions. Another has to do with the scope of the Postal Service's monopoly over letters. There's a few of these going on right now. One in particular, I think, is significant to mailers and to this audience, and I'll get to that in just a second. The PRC in the time of COVID, and I'm looking at this slide and I realize I put COVID impact in bold, imposing letters, maybe implying that COVID has had a deleterious impact on the Commission. In fact, it really hasn't. The pandemic has not had a major impact on the PRC's operations. The Commission had already developed a continuity protocol prior to the pandemic, so it was well prepared to keep running as the world began migrating to remote working conditions. The entire agency is teleworking full time. It's reviewing and I think in almost all cases approving NSAs. It's reporting to Congress, and it is continuing its rate review work for market dominant products, which is a good segue. So let's talk about that. There we go. So this is the most significant rulemaking proceeding that the PRC has on its docket right now. It's been going on for some time. We call it the 10-year review. Let me give you some brief background into this, and this may be repetitious for some of you listening, but new for others. So we talked about the 2006 law, PAYA, Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, passed in December of 2006. And when Congress did that, it instructed the PRC to establish a modern system for regulating rates and classes for market-dominant products. we could take an hour by ourselves just talking about this. So I only want to stop the high points. And let me bring your attention to three aspects of the law. Number one, Congress said that the rate system has to accomplish some objectives. There are 9 of them. I won't regurgitate all 9 here, but some of them favor postal customers. For example, postal rates have to be predictable and stable. They have to be just and reasonable. The Postal Service has to be incentivized to operate efficiently and maintain high-quality standards. Those all sound like reasonable objectives, right? I think they do. At the same time, the system has to give the Postal Service pricing flexibility. It has to assure that the Postal Service can earn adequate revenues. No objective is more important than the other. You look at all of them at the same time in conjunction with each other, but the system has to accomplish all of them as best it can. Number 2, the system has to include a price cap. Matt explained why. Left on its own, the monopoly will charge you prices that are too high and will crush its most inelastic customers, the ones that rely on the Postal Service the most. Those of you who send, periodicals and you don't want to go completely digital. People who send letters and greeting cards and brochures and catalogs and the like. Congress's restraint on the Postal Service's monopoly power under this law was that annual price changes to market-dominant postal product classes had to be capped by the Consumer Price Index. Thirdly, the system had to be reviewed 10 years after the law was enacted to determine whether it's working. So that's why we call it the 10-year review. The rulemaking began in December of 2016, but if you're keeping score, we're now in the middle of 2020, and the 10-year review is close to celebrating its 4th birthday. Some of us in the postal world who are not as funny as we think we are jokingly refer to this as the 13-year review, the 14-year review. So in 2017, the Commission issued its first set of regulations that would have allowed the Postal Service to raise market-dominant prices above inflation every year for 5 years. Mailers went nuts, justifiably so, and submitted voluminous comments criticizing the first proposal, and the Commission did not implement its first proposal. Rather, what it did was issue a second one at the end of last year. And that second proposal, which is the one that we're sort of sitting with now, has also generated significant participation and umbrage by mailers and vendors and trade groups. And why is that? Because, as you see here, this second proposal will again threaten massive price hikes on mailers. This revised proposal, if it were implemented, would allow the Postal Service to impose huge price hikes on all of you who mail letters, cards, periodicals, advertising mail. You're a nonprofit, fundraising appeals, catalogs, newsletters, bulletins, flyers. You get the picture. The new proposal would allow the Postal Service to implement annual price increases that not only track inflation, but on top of that, would give the Postal Service pricing authority tied to increases in the Postal Service's cost per mail piece driven by declines in year-over-year mail density. That's a fancy way of saying losses tied to declines in volume. And on top of that, additional pricing authority tied to the amount of money that the Postal Service needs to make to pay for its retirement funding that Matt mentioned. And on top of that, an additional extra point of pricing authority for hitting so-called productivity marks that aren't really marks at all. And finally, an extra 2% for products that don't cover their own costs. If you use marketing mail, catalogs, newsletters, advertising, this applies to you. If you mail periodicals, it might apply to you as well. Matt and I represent some trade associations who commented on this. We worked with some postal economists who estimated that this proposal will cost mailers in aggregate $8 billion a year with a B. And note that this proposal came out before COVID. And why is that important? Well, because as Matt explained, during the pandemic, while package volume has gone way up, market-dominant mail volume has gone down. On a revenue basis, that's okay for the Postal Service because packages are more profitable. They cost more. But unfortunately and puzzlingly, the PRC's proposal doesn't focus on revenues. It focuses on volume. So as market-dominant mail volume is down almost 30% according to April's numbers, and May's numbers should come out today, the results for mailers like all of you listening could be disastrous. You could be hit with 6, 7, 8% above inflation price increases if this proposal were to be enacted. So my time is running short, but remember at the beginning of this section when I said the PRC is supposed to protect captive mailers, this proposal doesn't seem to do that. A quick word on status. PRC staff is still reviewing parties' comments. There were lots of them. They'll be briefing the commissioners soon. Some associations asked the commission to press the pause button on this, ending the end of the pandemic. The commission declined. We've heard very recently that we can expect formal action from the commission as early as the summer, but far more likely in the fall. We've heard from one commissioner we will definitely have a formal decision by the end of the year, but as the actor says, nothing is guaranteed in this business. Stay tuned. We'll want to see what comes out of the commission. Almost certainly will be challenged in court, and we want to keep fighting to protect captive mailers from these hikes. With that, it falls on me to provide you with your CLE code. The CLE code is Postal 2020. That's Postal 2020. And with that, I'm going to hand it to my legislative colleague, Nick Choate. Nick, take it away.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I'm going to spend a few minutes here just touching on what Congress has done, is looking at doing, and possibly could do in the coming weeks and months on postal issues. As my colleagues have mentioned already, there's quite a bit Congress could do as relates to the Postal Service, whether that is direct funding, loan authority, or addressing bigger structural issues such as the retirement pre-funding requirements. As a practical matter, I think what we're talking about between now and the November elections is whether, if and to what extent, Congress will provide financial assistance as needed to the Postal Service. So what has been done so far, the CARES Act, which was the third COVID-19 response package that Congress passed earlier this year, that was signed into law in late March, it provided loan authority for the Postal Service to borrow up to $10 billion from Treasury. They have not yet tapped those funds by public and private accounts. The Treasury Department wants to attach conditions to that loan that the Postal Service considers onerous. So then we move to the fourth COVID-19 response package, which is still working its way through Congress. The House-passed bill would provide a $25 billion direct appropriation, as well as language blocking the loan conditions that Treasury wants to attach to the previously authorized $10 billion loan. That bill awaits action in the Senate. We expect it will be mid-July at the earliest before we see anything from the Senate on that. And then just this week, House Democrats released their infrastructure bill, which they're expected to take up next week. That includes another $25 billion on top of the $25 billion the House has already passed. This specifically for postal fleet vehicle fleet modernization. So where do things go from here? There are a few potential obstacles, with a caveat that there is significant bipartisan support in both chambers for addressing postal issues. There are some key Republicans, notably Chairman Johnson in the Senate and Ranking Member Jordan in the House, whose committees have jurisdiction over the Postal Service, have raised concerns about the accuracy of the financial projections the Postal Service provided to Congress earlier this year. There seems to be some legitimacy to that skepticism based on the numbers that have been released publicly since then. President Trump is another factor, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle. His concerns and frequent tweets about the Postal Service and voting by mail and package arrangements with Amazon are all potential barriers to postal legislation. I think it is an open question what, if anything, the president would be willing to sign related to the Postal Service. And then just a calendar reality is that we are in an election year, and while Congress certainly isn't going to let the Postal Service go bankrupt during an election year, their preference might be to do nothing at all if that's possible. Very few bills will become law before the November elections. After the 4th of July, the Senate is scheduled to be in for 7 weeks and the House for 6 weeks between 4th of July and Election Day. So very little time to address matters as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the Senate action on the next COVID response bill would probably be mid-July at the earliest. I think that's the next signal we will get as to what, if anything, is realistically in play as far as assistance for the Postal Service from Congress. And I think that's a general overview. Happy to take any questions on that at the end, but I think I will now kick it over to my colleague, Janice.
Thanks so much, Nick. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Janice Ryan. I'm a nonprofit and political law lawyer, and I'm just here to talk to you a little bit about today. I'm sorry, I'm going to advance my slide, about the importance of the mail and the Postal Service in election season, and particularly in this current pandemic. Direct mail continues to be a powerful method of reaching voters. I anticipate that it will continue to be something that folks are going to want to use in order to communicate with voters during this election season. And so this is the time of year, especially as we get closer to the general election, when I hear from clients with questions in particular about how they might be able to use their nonprofit U.S. marketing mail authorization or their nonprofit postal permit for their advocacy efforts. Mail can be expensive when you consider the cost of printing, materials, postage, and handling. And so if you are able to send your communications under your discounted nonprofit mail rates, you may be able to reach more people with your message. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the nonprofit marketing mail permit process, who's eligible, and some restrictions on use and how it can be used. And then we'll talk about the increase of use of vote by mail this year in this year's election. If you have a marketing mail permit, then you know some of this. If you don't, you may be eligible if you are organized as one of, about 10 categories of nonprofit organizations. It's not strictly available to 501c3 organizations, or what we think of as public charities, who are out there working on education, religious issues, science, research. There are categories for labor organizations, agricultural organizations, fraternal organizations, veterans organizations, among others. 501c4 social welfare organizations can also qualify. If you want to send mail at discounted nonprofit rates, you have to apply for authorization from the Postal Service. You would go seek that permit at the post office where your organization will be sending mail. And it's something worth exploring if you haven't done so. One thing that's really important to note is that the permit is specific to the organization that has applied for and received it. So the mail that you send under your permit must belong to the authorized organization. You may not lend your permit to an affiliated organization. This means that if you operate in a group of affiliated organizations, perhaps you have a 501c3 and a related C4, perhaps also a related political committee like a super PAC. The C3 could not lend its permit to send mail on behalf of the C4 and vice versa. Similarly, if your C4 holds a permit, it can't send mail under that permit for a related but separate political committee. There is one exception, which is for what's called a separate segregated fund under federal campaign finance law and under some state and local campaign finance laws. This is a specific type of political committee, which is really just a bank account managed and held by the sponsoring nonprofit organization. In that case, the Postal Service has provided guidance that says the nonprofit mail permit may be used by the authorized organization to send mail related to the SSF. There are some content restrictions for the mail that you're allowed to send under your nonprofit permit. Primarily, the Postal Service has rules requiring mail with certain personal information to be sent as first-class mail, not as marketing mail. But what's important to make clear is that communications involving political messages, whether they're to support or oppose candidates, they're related to legislative advocacy or other types of policy advocacy, can be sent using the organization's nonprofit permit. And one additional note here that I think is important is that even if your organization does not have a nonprofit permit or may not be eligible for a nonprofit permit, you can send these kinds of political advocacy materials as regular U.S. marketing mail under existing Postal Service guidance. This just means that you do not have to send those kinds of communications as first-class mail. So for example, for political committees, separate political committees that are not SSFs, this could be helpful and provides lower rates than first-class mail, even though they're not subject to the nonprofit discount. One question that I get with some regularity during an election season related to mail, direct mail, is whether and how the organization sending the mail is required to identify itself, whether on the envelope or in the mail piece itself. And for various reasons, this can be important for strategic reasons to the organization that's sending the mail. And the rule is that the name and return address of the organization must be on either the envelope or prominently on the mail piece itself. You are required to use the organization's official name. So it is permissible to use a doing business as or trade name or some other significant program name for the organization in conjunction with the official name. And it is also important to note that you can use any address belonging to the organization. The address does not, for example, have to be the headquarters address of the organization sending the mail. It also does not have to be the same address that the organization may have used on the application that it filed with the post office to receive the nonprofit postal permit. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about vote by mail. And during this pandemic, there's certainly going to, and we have seen already during the primary election phase, an increased use by state and local election officials of the mail to conduct elections. All jurisdictions have experience using the mail to do elections. We have a long history of military and overseas voters, and some jurisdictions have been conducting elections entirely by mail for some time. But because of the pandemic, because of the public health concerns with conducting in-person elections, more states are shifting to mail to provide an additional opportunity, and in some cases exclusive way for voters to participate in elections. The Postal Service works very closely with state and local elections officials to support their efforts to design, print, deliver ballots to the voters and handle those ballots and deliver them back to the elections offices. One question that I think comes up is, is there some sort of requirement for the state to pay for return postage so that voters do not have to put a stamp on the envelope when they are returning their ballots? In some jurisdictions, it is required by law that the state or the local or county government pay for return postage. But that is definitely the exception, not the rule. During this pandemic time, we've seen some states choose to pay for return postage, even though there's no specific regulation or state law requiring it. So what is the role for outside groups during this time? I've seen that groups are very interested in communicating with voters given the uncertainty and the changes that are occurring with rescheduled elections, new processes being put in place. Everyone is interested in making sure that voters understand how they can vote and what the deadlines are. It's really important and a good thing to be able to explain those things. But if you're going to communicate with voters about deadlines in particular and about change processes, it's very important that you do your homework so as not to potentially or inadvertently mislead anyone. One of the things that I think is interesting about vote by mail, and in particular with deadlines, is understanding when does a ballot need to be received in order to be counted. In some jurisdictions, the voter could place their ballot in the Postal Service on the day of election and it will be counted. So the postmark will be evidence that it was timely submitted. In other jurisdictions, the ballot must be received by the elections office on election day, on or before election day. And so when you're thinking about how you communicate with voters, it's important to think about the time that it takes the Postal Service to handle and deliver the mail, whether that relates to the deadlines for requesting an absentee ballot, if that's necessary, or the timing that it takes for the elections office to deliver the ballot and for the voter to submit the ballot and have it delivered back to the elections office. So counting back from the election date and the deadline to give your voters some sense of when they really actually should be placing their ballot in the mail is really important. One thing that I have seen is some groups have asked about providing can we provide stamps or free postage to voters to make it easier for them to participate in elections conducted by mail? There is a federal law that prohibits anyone from paying or promising or offering to pay anyone to register to vote or to vote. What is allowed is providing something of value, like a free ride to the polls, that actually makes it easier for someone who has already decided to vote to vote. And I think that providing stamps or free postage is probably akin to providing free rides to the polls. So I think that that's been something that's been interesting to consider. With that, I think that we have a few questions in the chat room, and I wanted to be able to hand things back over so that we could hopefully answer one or two of those.
All right, this is Matt. Let's see what we've got here. I've got a question asking about how do you reconcile the universal service guarantee and using Postal Service for last mile delivery by other shippers with various restrictions placed by Congress, and how the Postal Service can remain competitive with other commercial shippers without direct appropriations or additional flexibility from Congress and the PRC? I mean, that's a good question. That really goes to the heart of what we're doing. I mean, I think that there's a couple answers to that. One, as far as appropriations go, it really depends on what we want the Postal Service to do. When we talk about the universal service obligation, historically, the Postal Service has been able to provide that universal service without appropriation. Prior to COVID, it was still able to do that if you take away the pre-funding obligations. It was pretty, as I said, pretty close to break even. So from that perspective, you can say, well, if we stop saddling the Postal Service with these obligations that no other entity has, then they should be able to do that. The other answer is that there's still a lot of value in that last mile delivery, and there's a lot of value in the Postal Service's monopoly still. There's still, as I said, 143 billion pieces of mail going out. It's really on the Postal Service to leverage that value and to use that to enable it to continue to provide universal service. And I think it has the capability to do that. There are things that Congress could do to make it easier for them to do that. And with the impact of COVID, it might make sense for additional support to come from Congress to deal with this unprecedented situation. Eric, I think there's another question. You want to take that one?
Sure. I think the question was, how will the new Postmaster General, DeJoy, recently appointed by Trump, affect USPS? So, I mean, the honest answer is nobody really knows, but I think that perhaps subsumed within the question is maybe a concern that, this is a Trump loyalist place within the Postal Service to either prioritize it or destroy it from within, and I don't think that will happen. As Matt explained at the beginning, this is really an appointment by the governors. DeJoy does, have a lot of logistics background, comes to the table with some good qualifications, and in the face of some Senate questioning regarding his appointment, I believe stepped away from one of his RNC positions to avoid any appearances of impropriety. So I honestly think that the future of the Postal Service it lies more in the hands of the regulator and more in the hands of Congress, frankly. I'm hopeful that that the new PMG is not going to make tremendous disruptive waves. But that's just my opinion. I don't know if Matt or others have a different one. And with that, unfortunately, it looks like we are at the end of the hour. And we very much appreciate everyone's time and attention. We hope this was useful. Our contact information is on this last slide. So if you do have any other follow-up questions that we didn't get to, please don't hesitate to contact any of us. With that, stay safe and keep well.